document is also looking at the various aspects of delivering a sustainable cities. And as Jacqueline have mentioned, we are CDPA list city, and a lot of our plans actually align to the national and also state governments. So if you look at the our journey on low carbon, we actually started way back. We are a pioneer city in Malaysia, I would say, that look into low carbon. We launched our blueprint way back in 2012. And recently, last year, we reviewed this document, to actually address the gap that we have, because all this while, our low carbon city document focus on mitigation. And during the review, we have added climate action plan, and it is actually inclusive of the adaptation plan. Hang on. Okay, when we talk about our climate action plan, our climate mitigation target, Malaysia NDC is at 45% reduction, intensity reduction. And we used to actually put a target of 58% intensity reduction. And recently, with this new document, scientifically done, not plugging from the air, we have actually pledged for 70% intensity reduction to GDP based on 2010. So there are a lot of areas, because every 2 years since 2016, we have been doing our GHG inventory to look at the performance of the region. So um, through AIM modeling, we actually look at what are the gaps, and what are initiative at hand, and also plan and actually measure this, whether we are able to achieve the 70%. And yes, the scientific modeling says, if you do A, B, C, D, you should be able to actually achieve 70% and beyond. But it is a tall order. But I guess from our perspective, if you don't put a target, you know, people will just um, take it as, take it for granted that, something is happening, someone is addressing climate change, but nobody do anything. So that's what we worried. So all our document is actually shared with all the local council, cascaded down to the local councils, and aligned to the state government of Johor under their Pelan Pembangunan Mampan. So a lot of these activities that we have in our climate action plan has been mainstreaming, at the state and national level also. We also focus on this adaptation target, but as you know, in Malaysia, there is no adaptation target. So what does it mean by, reducing uh, community, reducing property loss at 50%? We don't have a number. But we say from whatever the current situation is, we want to reduce by 50%. And now is the time for us to define what is the base and what is 50% reduction. So this is something that we work together with a lot of agencies and also ministries, to establish that for Iskandar Malaysia. And I think there are many actions or measures that being proposed, and these measures actually we shared with all the agencies to gain feedback and to align, because we do not want to do uh, excuse me, we do not want to do an overlapping things with, our agencies. We might as well work in collaboration. And and to achieve some of these initiative actions, the objective and outcome, uh, I think everybody would agree that we do not have the expertise even at the PBT level, local authority level. We need to actually learn from others. We need to work with others in collaboration with, other international and also local agencies to bring about changes. So East Kanda Malaysia have been able to attract, since from very beginning, a lot of interest from international collaborators. So we have quite a number of city-to-city program. For example, with the city of Kita Kyushu looking at circular economy, and that have been going on since 2014 until today. And we also work with Toyama City on the carbonization of the transportation sector. And we are moving into the second phase of the collaboration. We work with of course, under UK Prosperity Fund, we work with UK FCDO and also West Midland Combined Authority, to look at smart integrated mobility management and a lot more. Currently we have a few projects under USTDA and Department of State, and looking at modern farming, looking at new technology in terms of agriculture. And in our low carbon program implementation and monitoring, uh, we have about uh, 284 of our programs, and 60 of it have been completed, and close to 200 is currently being implemented in phases. And these are some of the programs that we have, which I will share in more detail later. And we also are the first region in terms of using the GPC standard, the global standard for community scale greenhouse gas emission. And we actually do our carbon inventory, GHG inventory every 2 years. And I think the recent 2019 figures shows that, we have been able to reduce 19.7%. I think the challenges in doing GHG inventory is to get data, uh, data relevant to Iskandar Malaysia. So currently, we are using national data, and then you scale down to Iskandar Malaysia. We hope, and we are establishing our Iskandar Malaysia Urban Observatory, and we hope that through this observatory, we can bring together all agencies to share their data so that the GHG inventory can be more accurate in the future. And I share with you some of the low carbon program implementation. And as Jacqueline mentioned, through the quadruple helix collaboration involving the government, researchers, private sectors, and people on the ground. So this has been a very successful projects. Recently, I think we have, but we are focusing more towards awareness and education. Because we feel that awareness and education is important to shape the future generation, to provide that understanding. And we know through some of our programs, they are also able to influence, the community, their families, and also their communities. So Sudut Lestari is a place where everyone can go and get themselves equipped, or with the knowledge relating to climate change, relating to how do you address pollution, how you manage your waste, so it's actually open to all levels of community, from young children to adults. And we also have this Iskandar Puteri Rendah Carbon. I think I remember just now in one session, Encik Syarif from Maybank was talking about how they actually provided grants for sustainable programs. And I think our PBT have been taking initiative to actually provide grants for the community to implement, sustainability program. And every year it have increased, and last year it increased to 500,000 for the community in Iskandar Puteri. And Iskandar Malaysia Eco Life Challenge is one of the most successful program that we actually roll out for children school children in Iskandar, Malaysia, and now it's already covered 908 schools for the whole Johor, with the participation of 100,000 students and reach out of 500,000 community. So these are some of the adaptation programs and initiative that is funded by government. Some of it studies, some of it's actually infrastructure project. And we are embarking into several adaptation programs also in the future through several grants that we have recently received also from CTCN on the multi-hazard platform, learning from what DBKL have been doing. Um, uh, and we hope that this will be further expanded to meet some of the adaptation targets that we have. And there are 3 projects that I'm actually, do I have time? Okay, very quickly, 3 projects that might interest you. One is actually Rumah Iskandar, Malaysia. It's actually a transit house project by federal government. It's actually through RMK 9 development expenditure. And this is different than the normal, what we call that, rumah mampu milik, yang the other rumah mampu milik. Because this actually, even the building of the housing is adopt green developments, looking at green technology and putting environmentally friendly features through BEAM, through the renewable energy, rainwater harvesting, and so on. So we have also, this place is also very successful in their recycling program, green community program, and an example to be followed by other public housing in Johor. And this is the only public housing that have no problem over maintenance fee payment. Okay, because that's the challenge, I think, in Johor. The state government struggle, with non-payment of maintenance fee. So this is the only place 100%, but it have to come with a lot of efforts and programs that also what we call that that helps the tenants, to actually pay for part of the maintenance fee. So we do it through the Green Community Program. The second one I'd like to share is the Sungai Segat Rejuvenation Program. And I think this is to actually not only to improve the water quality in Sungai Segat, but also to address flood mitigation and sewerage system in the old city, because Johor Bahru is an old city, and the area where Sungai Segat is a heritage and culture area, so we need a lot of improvements. Despite the fact that there is no guideline in MSIG over the development of centralized sewerage treatment plant that includes sewerage and also drainage, but we managed to actually get approval for that, and we know that MSIG guidelines is currently being updated to include this model for Johor. But what I want to actually bring to your attention is this. Now, for such a big infrastructure or project like this that costs almost 400 million, how can we find a model that make the maintenance work? Because if local council is only going to allocate 1% for the maintenance budget, there is no way that this can be sustainable in the future. So what can, probably I'll throw it back to all of you. What can be done, to make sure that our infrastructure can be maintained properly? What model would work? So that is something that I'd like to share. This goes not just for this particular project, all road projects in Malaysia. All right. We've been talking to KKR, JKR, and at state level, can we find a way, you know, for us to better maintain through I don't know, maybe advertising on the pillars of the highways. I don't know whether that works or not, but can someone look at that? Because otherwise, if you look at the current situation, our roads are poorly maintained. Even our highways. That's why there's a lot of accidents, blah 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 blah, blah. Because it have other ripple effect, you know, on that failure. And probably the last one that will be very interesting is our IRT project, the bus rapid transit system. Now, government give us 1.2 billion for infrastructure. All right. But again, 1.5 million will have to come from private sectors in terms of the rolling stocks, ticketing and fare box, operation centers. So the question here is, if my operator who participate in this particular project and programs, for them to actually procure buses, it would actually be very expensive for them. Is there any mechanism, any green financing that can reduce, that can de-risk the financial part? So that is something that probably we would like to know and we would like to explore. And also, everywhere around the world, public transport is financed by the government. Now, if government says um, pass the risk to the private sector, what does it mean? How would that work? So these are the things that still lingers, not been resolved, that would affect the sustainability of the system in the future. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Puan Kamisa. For the benefit of the audience that's joining us virtually, I've been advised that you should start, posing your questions on Slido. It's hashtag JC3J20, and you have to select the room number 4. I would like to get the panel going on the next thematic topic on sustainable cities. So without further ado, I do encourage even the people that are present with us here to use Slido, because apparently if you speak through these mics, the people online will not be able to hear your question. But if you prefer to pose your questions via this mic, it's fine. I will just repeat it again orally. So without further ado, our next expert is Ms. Daphne Archaya, Sustainability Strategy and Insights Lead for Southeast Asia at Arup. She is a British national from London and is currently based in Kuala Lumpur. Her regional role at Arup is wide-ranging, from advising investors, developers, and governments on how they can benefit from sustainable development by adopting low-carbon, resilient, and circular economy approaches. Daphne has worked with several of Arup's strategic partners, such as C40 Cities under Climate Action Program Planning in Southeast Asia and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on Circular Real Estate Business Model. Kindly put your hands together to warmly welcome Ms. Daphne Archaya. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Jacqueline. And good to see so many different faces here. And if I could see you online, I'd probably say the same thing. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the lessons I've learned when it comes to financing sustainable cities. So what's the actual strategy for developing a low carbon and resilient city strategy that can be readily funded and financed? So there's actually a lot of guidance already out there from the likes of the Global Covenant of Mayors, where Jacqueline's from C40 Cities, where Alyssa is from, and also the Asian Development Bank on how you actually develop low carbon and resilient city strategies. And actually, they're all quite similar, which is great. They have very, very slight differences. For example, the Global Covenant of Mayors, there's a slightly um, bigger focus, say, on well, reducing energy consumption, and the targets are required for 2030, whereas C40, they require more of a Paris-aligned decarbonization pathway to 2050. And the Green City Action Planning Program guidance from the Asian Development Bank, there's less of a focus on targets and more around the actual definition of the actions and implementation planning. But as I said, generally, the approach is the same. You get a city's commitment to be involved and have targets in place. You undertake baseline assessments, and actually, all three of the guidance documents that were shared previously require a greenhouse gas assessment and require a climate risk assessment. This then informs targets, strategies, and actions around decarbonization and climate resilience. You then prioritize these actions, think about the implementation planning, and put that in a report that then gets published and hopefully periodically evaluated and updated. This is underpinned by a lot of data collection and stakeholder insights, which I'm sure Alyssa will go into. But while they are the same, and I make it sound super easy, the process sounds really easy in practice, we know that it's not so easy because cities are still struggling to finance actions, climate actions that are contained within their plans. So what are some of these challenges? So the first three I'd like to go through. The first one is too much time is spent on the first part, the baselining. When you get a city or a consultant on board, first and foremost, to do the baselining, they're either really inundated with data, they have to sift through it, find out what's the most important. But as Juan Camisa said, there's also a lack of data. So a lot of time is spent collecting that data, making sense of it. And actually, too much time is spent on that rather than moving on. There's a need to be evidence-based, of course, when you're developing these climate action plans, but there's also a time to say, you know what, this is sufficient data enough for me to move on now because, and this leads me to my second challenge, you're not leaving enough time for financial planning of priority actions. And actually, this is not something that cities only are feeling as a challenge. As we heard yesterday from CDP, when CDP reviews transition plans, most people are scoring really, really poorly on the financial planning aspect. So it is a global issue. And then finally, another challenge is that most cities, or if not all cities in Malaysia, the majority of their climate actions are funded or financed through federal and state government, which means they do not have a credit score, which means they cannot access finance in capital markets, which is a big issue. So a bit of audience participation here. I want to see if you actually corroborate anything I've just said. So put your hands up if you've read a city-level climate action plan or a green city action plan. Actually, 80% is just background information, and 20% is the actual strategy bit, the meat that really you understand. So would you agree with that? If you do, please put your hand up. So we have some agreement in the room. Okay. Maybe you haven't read a city strategy yet. The second question, please put your hand up if you've read a city strategy and you come away thinking, how are they even going to finance or implement that? Yeah, a little bit more agreement. Okay, so I'm not going crazy. People also feel the same as me. Good. But luckily, there are some solutions out there, and I'd like to share them with you. So the first one is from the Asian Development Bank. So as many of you may know, the Asian Development Bank have a Green City Action Planning Program in Malaysia, where they'd like to develop 14 Green City Action Plans in Malaysian cities. But it's not just about developing the plan. They would also, as part of the scope, require capital investment planning to take place. And what does that mean? It's really about understanding the city's investment capacity and how this can be enhanced through things like revenue mobilization, revenue enhancement, land value capture, etc. And I think one good example here is thinking about upgrading waste treatment capacity with the additional capacity then sold on to either the private sector or to nearby cities. And actually, going through this whole capital investment planning process is really helpful at supporting credit scores in the future. The next example is one that's pioneered by the European Commission. It's called the Climate City Contract, and it's an innovative governance tool, not too dissimilar from capital investment planning, actually. But what it does, it brings together the commitments, the action plans, the investment plans. This then gets submitted to the European Commission, who then sign it off with this thing called the mission label. And in a way, it's like a quality assurance mechanism that says, the investment plan for all these actions makes sense, and therefore it unlocks opportunities for EU funding and financing programs, as well as other funding and financing programs. So next, a couple of the other challenges that I've come across. Firstly, sometimes there are just too many actions in a plan. And that's not the fault of anyone, in any individual. Typically, there's a long list of actions that you come, then you put that through a multi-criteria analysis, arrive at a short list, and then you engage the cities and other stakeholders about, are these the right ones? Have I prioritized the right actions? And then everyone's like, no, you need to include this one. No, you need to include this one. And actually, you end up back at that long list that you started with, right? And so there's just too many in the first place that don't get defined well enough. And also, the mitigation actions remain as mitigation actions, the adaptation actions remain as adaptation actions. There's very little crossover on how they are designed. At best, I think nature-based solutions tries to bridge that gap, but are we leveraging other agendas to actually design them in a way that financial resources can be optimized when delivering these actions? The second one is, that kind of contradicts a little bit of what our colleague from UNDP said yesterday, that the finance needs to be based on the need. And yes, it does. Yes, it does. But whenever you're defining actions from a city, you need to take into account what the private and financial sector are interested in. Because when it comes to actually going to market, understanding what funding and financing is available, you will not get the buy-in, you will not get interest from the private and financial sector if you haven't involved them in defining and designing the actions from the very beginning. And that's kind of linked to my last point about not just limiting engagement to the public sector, but widening that not just to the private and financial sector, but to NGOs, academia, etc. So another round of audience participation. so another round of audience participation. So who here has actually integrated decarbonization with climate resilience or any other agendas like the smart agenda, inclusivity agenda to define a climate action before? Please put your hand up. Okay, the panelists, yes, great. I would have expected so. And then question 4, who here has joined forces with the public, private, and financial sector to define city or any other climate action? Okay, we have one hand here. Great, amazing, thank you very much. And actually, I would encourage everyone in the room here to speak to the 3 people that have had their hand up, because they are a source of inspiration for us all, and we should be learning from them. But in the meantime, I'll also share some other sources of inspiration and case studies. So this one is an Arab project, actually, that we've just embarked on with Malacca City, where we're helping them to develop a smart and low carbon blueprint. So what we're doing is identifying synergies between the smart and the low carbon agenda, and then thinking about that actually how that addresses local plan priorities. And as I mentioned before, this is a great way of pooling resources and actually reducing the overall finance required to deliver on the outcomes and impacts that the city wants to meet. The next one is an International Finance Corporation IFC program called 30 by 30. And what that hopes to do is actually increase the lending portfolio of financial institutions in 4 countries to 30%. This is also another Arab project where we are looking at specifically scaling climate finance in green buildings in the Philippines. But it is a really, really good example of where the private, financial, and private sector has been brought together in rooms like this to discuss very frankly and openly what are the barriers and what are the solutions. And I can go into the solutions a bit during the discussion. And then finally, we have an example from the UK, which is the Green Home Finance Innovation Fund, which is a climate finance accelerator. And I'm not going to go through the actual examples that you can see on screen here, but the key takeaway is that the government launched a climate finance accelerator. It was a competition where people, financial organizations, as well as related organizations like insurers, could actually innovate in a semi-sandbox environment, climate financial products, so that it can help the residential energy efficiency retrofit market. So, to conclude, what strategies will you follow to develop a low carbon and resilient city strategy that can be readily funded and financed? I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up now, luckily, but I will use it to summarize the key points from my presentation. So, firstly, limit the number of actions and design them so you leverage multiple agendas when doing so. Make sure you're developing a capital investment plan to accompany your climate action plan. Engage across the private, financial, and public sector when designing them. Keep the focus on the investability of the actions. And finally, be open to innovative financial products in doing so. Thank you very much, and we can continue.
Thanks so much, Daphne. Following from your key takeaways, I wanted to just segue to a question. As the global economy adapts to climate change, businesses and investors are developing green finance, new ways of rating environmental credentials, risk, and opportunities, backed by funding instruments and new sources of investment. Green finance is a sign of the world economy's accelerating transition away from the fossil fuel era. What are some innovative financing mechanisms you have been part of under your Sustainable Urban Development Projects portfolio that you would like to share with the audience today that is worth replicating in Malaysia?
Thank you. So I think I'm not going to go through the blended finance stuff because I think that was described really well in an earlier session. But the other one, which I think links to a key topic that keeps being spoken about during this conference, is SMEs. How do we get SMEs involved? And so far, all we've really heard is like, let's teach them how to develop ESG strategies. But actually, there's other ways that we can do this too. In terms of gaining finance as an SME, it's tough. The cost of transaction is high and the risk is high. So one thing that we've come across is demand aggregation finance, where you actually get a pool of SMEs together and think about financial products that help to address their financing needs, but in a collective. So here you're reducing the overall transaction cost per organization, but also you're spreading the risk. So that's one that I've come across, which is really interesting. And then another one that actually, Puan Komisa, you asked the audience around is how can we think about operation and maintenance, because that's usually quite separate, right? The budgets are separate to the CapEx. So another one is the design, build, finance, operate, maintain model, which we can see in private finance initiatives across the globe. And really that's, I know it's a bit of a hybrid around delivery as well as finance, but it makes an organization who is embarking on this to not just think about the CapEx, but the OpEx as well. In that way, the design, build, finance, operate, maintain model helps them to think a bit more long term to reduce their overall operational and maintenance costs. So that's another one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daphne. Moving on to our final expert is Ms. Elisa Raj, who is the Deputy Regional Director for East Asia, Southeast Asia and Oceania at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. C40 is a network of nearly 100 mayors of the world's leading cities who are working together to deliver the urgent action needed right now to confront the climate crisis and create a future where everyone, everywhere can thrive. C40's team is headquartered in New York with offices in London, Johannesburg, Singapore, Delhi, Rio de Janeiro, Copenhagen, Beijing, and across 25 other different locations. We are happy that we have Elisa joining us in Kuala Lumpur today. Her primary role is to engage and support the 13 C40 member cities across 10 countries on matters relating to their climate change priorities, mitigation and adaptation action planning, as well as implementation, while facilitating city-to-city exchanges and encouraging increased climate ambitions of regional cities and their city leaders. Kindly warmly welcome Ms. Alisa Raj.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. This is the most challenging time slot going after two really great speakers who've covered quite a bit of topics that leads to this point, and also it's the after lunch slot, so thank you very much for your attention. I will try my best to keep it a bit shorter so that we can have time to get your questions as well. So C40 is actually an organization that is a network of 96 global megacities. So we work with bigger cities more often, and we really want to have our cities, number one, showcase the work that they're doing, because a lot of our cities are actually already undertaking actions beyond what national governments are doing, despite challenges, of course, as we've heard over the last 1.5 days. And of course, the second one is really push them to go further. So with that background, I will go through the first few slides a bit quickly and then spend a bit more time on highlighting a few examples of how we can actually strengthen climate action and how this relates to possible funding or financing opportunities and the roles that financial institutions and the private sector can play as well. So why do cities matter? Cities actually take up a really small landmass in the whole world, but they consume so much of the world's energy, food, production, that all ends up in cities, right? And we also really emit a lot of carbon emissions. Cities also generate a lot of finance, which means there is capital there, as we've also heard over the last 1.5 days. It's just how do we meaningfully access this in order to really scale the smaller initiatives that are currently going on. So these are C40's missions. I'm not going to go through them. They're there in the slides. We can share them with you later. But perhaps a quick snapshot of emissions by region. So C40 has divided our 96 member cities across 7 regions, and you'll see the yellow color ESEAO, which stands for East, Southeast Asia and Oceania region, that contains Kuala Lumpur. So what's really interesting is the average of our 13 member cities, carbon emissions per capita is 5.2, which is higher than the global average. But Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia's carbon emissions per capita is significantly higher than this. So yes, we are a developing country, but we also really, our electricity grid is very fossil fuel dominated and coal dominated. So this is food for thought. Just to let you know, the average Malaysian per capita emissions is about 8. My data is a bit old, so it could be a bit higher, a bit lower right now. This is from 2017. And Kuala Lumpur's is about 13. So it's really high. Yeah. So again, I know this was mentioned yesterday. I will leave it at that, just food for thought. And of course, I also wanted to just give a very quick snapshot of hazards. Now, this is actually a bit of a projection study, and it's specifically only looking at one hazard, which is riverine flooding, so overflowing of rivers, most of the time in rain events. Now, this is looking at the potential financial impact in 2050, and you'll see in the right bottom corner, the East, Southeast Asia, and Oceania region has much bigger bubbles, much bigger impacts. Everybody, remembers the 2021 floods, right? I mean, some people probably remember the 2006-07 floods before the Smart Tunnel, but the floods from 2-3 years ago really highlight that the infrastructure we have is no longer sufficient, and we still need to keep adapting and building the resilience of our city, especially as the climate is changing and as weather patterns are changing. So the intensity of the rainfall changes. The locations of where the rainfall actually changes also changes. So few things to keep in mind. So I am going to spend a bit more time on the next few slides, I promise. And I, of course, welcome any questions at the end, of course. So how do we really strengthen the actions of our cities? I'm going to use an example for each of these, but I just wanted to maybe put them in one slide. I think we really need to start being more thorough and integrated. Many speakers have already touched on the fact that there's been a lot of silo, there's been a lot of attention given to mitigation actions, or perhaps some mitigation actions are favored above others because they're easier. And there's no fault to this, that different cities, different companies, different locations have different contexts that we need to understand. But how can we, through our own capacities, try to see where we can make this more holistic? So that's the one key takeaway I hope today will have for everyone, that everyone starts thinking. The second one, of course, is really commit to being the solution within your organizations. Everyone here, you may be one or two people who's representing your organization, but what are you going to go back and take back and actually apply within your organization or perhaps within your personal life? Is there something that you can do? Is there something that you can do as a collective? And that, of course, leads me to the third point, which is engaging your stakeholders. So stakeholders, you often think, okay, clients in the private sector, but it could actually be partners. It could actually be the private sector or public sector. It could be the community. It could even be on a global stage, right? We do know that it's really important to start doing more and showing what you're doing, but of course to make sure that it's meaningfully done. So for the first point, where we're looking at thorough and integrated approach, I kind of wanted to use Jakarta's transportation sector improvements. The reason why I was inspired to use this is about 3 months ago, I had a few colleagues from Jakarta and Quezon City in the Philippines visit KL for a workshop. And they actually told me, they were like, oh, Alyssa, I didn't realize that Kuala Lumpur's traffic is actually as bad as or even worse than Jakarta's. This was rush hour. So this is really food for thought. When someone from Jakarta and Manila tells you that, your traffic is worse than theirs, you really start to question, right? So, I just wanted to highlight very quickly, and I'm not going to walk through the details, but I did want to point out that Jakarta's approach has been very integrated. It's not perfect. No system is perfect. I'm sure there's faults, but they really looked at the transport hierarchy and focused on what they can do best and how they can benefit the people who need it the most. So in any city, you have, of course, T20, M40, B40, or now it's B50. So, every city has their socioeconomic structures, and Jakarta is no exception, right? They're a city of 10 million people. So mass transit is really important. And over the last decade, the city has created a really good network, not only trains, which are very costly, but BRT, bus rapid transit systems. This doesn't require a huge capital. I mean, it does. To say there's no capital is a lie. But in comparison to, say, MRT or LRTs, BRTs can readily use the available roads. But it takes political leadership and commitment. And that's one big difference that you can see between KL, where only Federal Highway has kind of one BRT route, compared to Jakarta, where it's completely segregated, where it's hundreds of kilometers of routes and really reliable, fast transit. So this transition has taken time, but that's something important to point out. The additional thing that they've managed to achieve is that in 2022, 80% of the population live or work within 500 meters of a public transport stop. So this could be a small bus stop, but this has improved from about 50% in 2017, and they have a target of 95% of the population by 2030. So they're committed to improving access. And of course, as we know, poorer people can't afford cars. They can't afford to be stuck in traffic jam if you're working, on a daily wage hour, right? You don't want to spend 1 hour in the car. So this really opens up options, and it really prioritizes, lower socioeconomic communities. So the benefit is vast. The second thing is they've also integrated the informal sector for the first and last mile access. So I've personally never ridden on them, but there are these angkuts, which are kind of like jeepneys or tuk-tuks, that used to stop everywhere and just take people on their last mile transit journeys. They've incorporated some of them and are actually paying them wages so that it's free for public transport users. So these are small ways of how to actually improve your system in a bigger area. The second thing, I'm really not going to go into it, but cities have a lot of power of this. It's improving active mobility infrastructure, so cycling lanes and pedestrian walkways. The third one I'm going to go into is they've also started looking at transitioning the public transport fleet to electric vehicles. And this is something that it was a pilot together with C40 through the city's finance facility program, where they actually studied bus routes, the type of vehicles, how to actually make sure that the vehicles will be able to survive certain lengths, because it is a well-ridden public transport service. So as they transition this, what type of buses do they need? What type of charging infrastructure do they need? These studies need to be done before we can fully commit to purchasing, say, 10,000 vehicles by 2030. So we start by testing one or two. We then commit to a pilot of 100 buses, within the next sort of 3 to 5 years. I think they have about 70 this year already. This is from a few years ago. And then based on this, if everything goes well, your replacement of your existing buses will then transition towards EVs that you know will work. So this is the gap I think Daphne pointed out earlier, where we lack this sort of interim part where we know we want to go better public transport, better EV, but we don't just replace it straight away because we don't know if that's going to last. And then that will be a failure, and then we wouldn't want to finance that. So we need to start small, but we need to make sure we actually scale it up as well. The second one is, let me just check time. Okay, 2 more minutes. Commitment to being the solution. I think this is an adaptation project. And again, this doesn't cost a lot, but it does require long-term planning. So what Melbourne did is, from more than a decade ago, they started mapping out their trees, because trees can actually cool your microclimate. And I think this is a well-known fact. No one's going to argue with me here. But of course, the potential is arguable. But in a country like Australia, and even in Malaysia, like if you're standing underneath the shade and then you stand right in the middle of the road, you can feel that difference in temperature. So that's one example. So what Melbourne did was they really mapped out their trees. Number one, to understand, the actual situation with their trees, which are healthy, what types there are. The second one is to also assess the longevity of the tree, because they know the climate is changing. They know in 10 years, Australia is probably going to be 1 or 2 degrees hotter on a normal day, but in a heat wave, it could be 5, 6 degrees hotter. So they looked at the trees which will and won't survive heat events, and they slowly are working on replacing with more resilient trees. This is to make sure that if something happens, your city isn't, the urban plants, your nature in your city isn't just going to die off with one bad heat event, but it will actually survive. So this is the longer term planning that is required. And of course, I've put in there some targets as well. I don't need to go through them, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that in this sense, I think it's not only cities that can make the difference. It could be private building owners. Can we use the space in front to create a network of seamless small pocket parks that complement what City Hall is doing, that complement the work that's already being done. So these are really small things, but I think it can be done. Now, this is my second last slide. It really kind of highlights that cities are doing a lot. So in particular, I'm using Kuala Lumpur as an example. They are studying how to decrease their own city-owned building assets. So they've been doing this for a while with certain buildings, but now they're looking at 30 buildings of different scale in order to really show and highlight and become an example. Now, we know the private sector is already doing this, but the private sector sometimes are doing, like there's a few buildings, a few developers doing great work, and then there's a few that are doing okay work. So we really want to push them to do a lot better. But it's hard to do that if you're not doing it yourself. And I think the City Hall recognized that. So of course, they're looking at that from what the city is doing. They will face financial challenges because you have a budget every year. How do we make sure this is prolonged? How do we prioritize it? How do we capture it? How do we measure it and evaluate and then report back? So I think there's an element of transparency that really needs to be increased. And the second part, of course, is really how do we then make sure that our citywide buildings also, over time, actually improves? And there's really a lot of private sector financing that will be needed here. So I think, judging by the audience in the crowd, which is a bit more financial sector / private sector, the question is really, what can you do in your organization, your home, your neighborhood? Could you go around seeing where opportunities are to plant more trees? And could you work with neighbors and your local authority? It's not that easy, I admit. I know everyone's busy, but these are small things that you can start to look at. But also really understand that if you don't try to make this change, it will never happen, and so it has to start. And of course, lastly, most importantly, I know this has been spoken about 2 days in a row already, but be as inclusive as you can. Keep in mind that the person who should benefit the most are the people who need it the most. So when you do put in policies, you do want to make sure you have incentives for them. But the most important thing, not in this slide, is you also have to make sure that you're not at the same time putting in financing to lock in more carbon emissions and to create worse environments. By that, I mean, if from a financial sector perspective, you're giving lower interest rates for climate smart solutions, then give higher interest rates for not so climate smart solutions as well. That's just one example. But I think I have used my time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Elisa Raj. We have approximately about 9 questions on Slido, but I'll combine some questions and then I'll open it to the panel. So the first one is, there is curiosity on best practices taken from cities in China. And the other one would be, are there intercity collaborations to build up more robust climate action? So I leave it to who wants to take to answer.
When we talk about climate action, I think on initiative by cities, what I can share is that through our GCOM platform, I think GCOM is helping many cities in Malaysia and around the world in terms of developing their climate action plan. For us, except for Iskandar Malaysia, we've started much earlier. So it's about, aligning with the rest of the cities in Iskandar Malaysia itself.
Sure. So I think for the Chinese cities, one of the key things that quite a few cities have done is really the sponge city initiatives. So there's several cities where they've put in a lot of infrastructure. These could be ponds, these could be bioswales, which are like greenery that have a water holding and retention capacity in order to mitigate flooding. And that's one adaptation focused project. That's one example. I think there's a lot of a transition for electric vehicles that are smaller, so 2 and 3 wheeler, so motorcycle, electric bikes that are already in the system. So this is really quite good for some cities where their electricity is generated by hydro, but not all cities where the electricity is generated by fossil fuels, because China is really big, right? So those are the couple of key examples I have. And I think in terms of partnerships, there are actually quite a lot of partnerships that are ongoing. I think KL is working with Tokyo also on energy efficiency initiatives. I think Osaka and Quezon City are working on transport initiatives. They're looking at e-tricycles. So they're like small tuk-tuk like things that are being done. So happy to provide more emails, via email to share with others later.
And I just want to add, you are right. When we talk about, EV vehicles, I think China started with the e-buses, I think like 10 years ago probably. And I think at that time when we were planning for BRT, I remember that their EV buses is not only talking about EV buses, they have actually even studied or look at, what to do the next 10 years, 20 years, especially in terms of, the e-waste coming from batteries. So a lot of collaboration, I guess, by China and also cities in Malaysia.
Thanks. And I just added into the Slido that IURC has actually facilitated a project between Yangzhou in China and NCI Bologna in Italy on nature-based solutions and green spaces. That particular project has actually won a couple of awards. And if you're ever in Yangzhou, you might actually want to visit that particular project. The other question that was quite interesting was, what would be the first step for a city council like Kuala Lumpur City Hall, DBKL, to be more pedestrian friendly? Improving pedestrian facilities or disincentivize car usage?
Thank you for this question. I love it. They really have to deprioritize the car, but also improve the infrastructure at the same time. I actually think that KL is one of the least pedestrian friendly cities I've been in, and I actually injured myself this year because of a sidewalk that was uneven, and it's really hard to navigate with crutches. So we have a long way to go, but your question is 100% spot on. You have to deprioritize the car and motorized vehicles in order to make space and make things safer for pedestrians. You still have highways where cars are dominant, but for smaller streets and roads and connecting people to centers with a lot of activity, that should be people. And that includes people on wheelchairs. We're all going to be old one day, so we want to make sure that everyone is able to use roads safely and cheaply.
Okay, the next question is quite a down-to-earth question, to be honest. The person called K would like to know if there is anything an individual can do or in terms of behavior change they can adopt to improve and move towards a sustainable city.
There's a lot you can do for sure. I think I can start off with transport, I guess is a good one. While it is difficult, we have a choice to make, and you can choose to walk somewhere, you can choose to take the MRT somewhere, you can choose to even have the first mile as a grab and then take the MRT. So it's your decision. So first of all, you need to make that call on, are you going to spend an extra hour traveling or not? But the option is there, so make that choice, right? The second one is around the consumption of products and materials, kind of centered around the whole circular economy topic. So, are you going to keep consuming, keep buying because things are cheap, and actually, when something breaks, you just buy it again because it's easy for you to do so? Or are you going to get that repaired? Again, that's a choice that you can make, and I would choose repair, obviously, if I had the option. But also think about not just the repair aspect, but do you need something in the first place? Could you borrow it? Could you borrow it? If it's a one-time tool, like a drill, do you really need a whole drill that you're going to use twice in your life? Or could you borrow it from your neighbor, you know? And yes, these are small things, but those small things add up.
Probably what I can add also in some of our programs, especially on the green community, like you said, if you have an extra clothes, you can share with someone else, give to someone else. Stop buying every single new design, fashion, trends, or whatsoever online. That's my daughter. And then I think, when we talk about, even at home, that's why our Eco Life Challenge have been successful. It's like, mom, switch off the lights. Mom, we don't need the aircon. I think the students are able to tell their parents, so water consumptions, waste. If you know you're not gonna eat everything, why do you buy bulks of, fruits, vegetables, and it got rotten in the freezer, so there's a lot of things, and part of what we do during the program is to educate. When we educate the children educate the family members, then the whole lot, the community. In some of the schools, the neighborhood, the children, they even get all their neighbors to actually recycle, and their house become a small recycle center so that they can bring it to school. Then they can actually sell via Kita Semula, Kita Recycle. So it's interesting. There's a lot that can be done. I think if any of you get a chance to actually read about Eco Life Challenge in Iskandar, Malaysia, then probably you gonna get a lot of information how you yourself can start doing something.
Okay, just one last question from Slido. I think this is an interesting one. What are the first steps or projects an SME companies can do to meet SDG sustainable city?
This is an interesting question and really difficult because there's many different sectors that SMEs work in. So maybe I will just use one or two examples. I think firstly, look at your own company and what your company can do. Try your best to procure better products that are more environmentally friendly. And this could be worked into a longer term budget. So of course, if you're buying everything at once, it's really expensive. But over time, the biggest sources of emissions, and then try to tackle those. So it could be furniture, it could be paper, it could be, things that you use on a daily basis. Second thing is try to encourage your colleagues to do more as well. Again, SMEs can be anything from 3 people to, 60 or 200 people. I'm not exactly sure of the number, so it depends on the scale, but the impact can actually be bigger. There's one thing that wasn't mentioned earlier, but cut down your red meat consumption. So as an organization, have a small policy where we're not saying you can never eat it. We're just saying cut down where you can. Or as an organization, you may pick chicken rather than, rendang daging. So again, we're not saying don't eat it, but just cut down where you can, do the best you can. I think in terms of actual work and moving ahead, I think it's important for organizations of all sizes to start really pushing climate smart solutions. So make better decisions in terms of, the work that you do, what you can influence, even if that may not always create the outcome you want, but have those difficult discussions with your clients. If you're in the construction sector, tell the developers, we need better air conditioning. We need to make sure it's more efficient. Can we actually do away with air conditioning for certain areas? Can we, like kind of see what you can do through your work. If you are in legal practice, I am a bit unsure. I don't have any legal experience, but I think, try to do what you can depending on which field you are. So start tracking your own carbon emissions and usage. Where is your money going? It's basically like carbon audit as you do your financial audit, right? You're putting a, a sort of emissions to the dollar spent, and then see how you can slowly progress this. So it's not just about having that baseline, but it's also about having the targets and trying to achieve them. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will in a few years. And the better you look on paper in this sense, the better you're doing, the more people will want to do business with you in the future as well. So you're already starting, even if it may not be big because you're a small company, an impact is still an impact, right? So I would encourage start.
Okay, with that, I think I will wrap up this session. I believe that the panel of experts have articulated the urgent need to act as climate action frontliners. Each of you in the audience play a pivotal role with your key stakeholders, whether at city, state, or national level, to activate the quadruple helix and make it a reality. Leveraging on climate finance at scale and pace to invest in sustainable green cities is urgent. Today's thematic session have disclosed how cities are promoters, enablers, facilitators, connecting the dots, and today we hope you realize how to make climate ambitions a reality and how you can serve the citizens better by ensuring you roll out bankable projects collectively, which are not just profitable, but also sustainable for the long term, where the proposals must quantify the projected positive outcomes, such as social or environmental benefits, and has clear mechanisms for implementation and evaluation. For the bankers and the financial experts in the audience who are interested to know how to be involved in the matchmaking process of downstream financing, we are happy to talk with you after this session and how you could be involved in the matchmaking post-project preparation facilities such as the TAP Fund, the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, the Cities Development Initiatives Asia with ADB, as well as Fonds Municipalité Development pour les Villes. It's a French fund, FMDV, which they also have a Jakarta office as well. So those who are passionate about implementing the high impact projects that we shared earlier, you can catch up with a panel of experts as well. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and kindly give your final generous applause to the panel of experts today. Thank you.